Hi, hello, my name is Sam, my pronouns are they, them, and welcome back to my office where we talk about queer shit, cozy shit, horror shit, and fantasy shit, and chihuahuas. Today, I am here to give y'all a review on one of my all-time favorite authors' newest books coming out on September 3rd of this year, and that is Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. I was lucky enough to receive an e-arc of this off NetGalley, and let me just tell you, this has been my most anticipated read of all of 2024. When I found out there was a queer trans Appalachian horror coming out, sign me right up. I felt the same way about Lee Mandello's book earlier this year that I believe I also did a review on, If You Want More Queer Trans Appalachian Horror. And that was The Woods All Black. Also great. That is besides the point. When I found out that there was a second queer trans Appalachian horror coming out this year, I was on it. I was so ridiculously excited to read this book, and let me tell you, it did not disappoint. I want to start this out before I even give you the pitch by telling you about some of the trigger warnings, because they are severe. You might say, oh, it's a YA, how bad can it be? Bad. It can be bad. I'm gonna promise you that. So let me just say there are trigger warnings for severe gore, transphobia, gun violence, and just violence in general. It is a brutal book. I also want to give a trigger warning for literal generational trauma. I feel like that's a fair trigger warning to give. Like, not just emotional, but also like physical generational trauma. And with those trigger warnings given, let's dive into this book. Andrew Joseph White's newest book, Compound Fracture, is a love story to Appalachian history while simultaneously capturing my award, my most horrifying book of the year. Gear up for a queer trans Appalachian story filled with gore, revenge, self-acceptance, and very literal generational trauma as Miles connects with his ancestors and tries to survive his small town grudges. This story follows Miles, who is a trans boy who just finished his junior year of high school in Twist Creek, West Virginia. This story all starts when he decides to sneak out one night to go to a party just after he's finished his junior year, and he gets brutally attacked by a group of boys who are known bullies and the son of one of the Davies, a family that has been against Miles' family, I think it was since the 1900s. And from there, we unravel the history of Miles Abernathy's family as he sees his great-great-grandfather, Saint Abernathy, as a ghost. Let's just say that we start this book off with a violent, near-death scene. And while we don't witness the actual beating of Miles, really, because he falls unconscious, we definitely witness the aftermath. And this is no small thing. Miles Abernathy is a 16-year-old who, in a poor family, he is a leftist, is very well attuned to what is going on in his town, his state, his country, all around. And he is very actively focused on social change and educating himself on how communism and socialism really come forth and make a society better. And all of this originally starts because he knows of his great-grandfather, Saint Abernathy, who was killed by Sheriff Davies with a rail spike through the mouth as a consequence to some protests. I don't know if you want to call it protests. It's much more than a protest, but I'm going to use the word protest. against coal mines back in the 1900s. The history of St. Abernathy alone is just beyond interesting. The history that we learn of St. Abernathy alone throughout the story could be a story in and of itself, of queerness in the early 1900s, protesting and unions and coal mines in the Appalachian area, of family in the early 1900s as a queer person. Could have been a story in and of itself, but it was beautifully intertwined with Miles' story of agony and rage. So after Miles gets beat to hell, he ends up accidentally witnessing the death of one of the people who beat the living hell out of him. I say witness because he treats it like he offed this son of a bitch, and he did not at all. It was completely an accident, but he knew that it would not be taken that way because he was an Abernathy. And in Twist Creek, the Abernathys are like to be avoided at all costs. They are always poor. They're always on the bad side of the Davies, who are the sheriffs in town, like the most influential and the most powerful family in town. And every generation of Abernathy is directly against the generation of Davies, and violence always ensues between them. So Miles knew that he was screwed the second he saw that. And things just unfolded from there. It was wild. It was wild to lay witness to. This is going to be a no spoiler review. I just want to put that out there because obviously it's August. This doesn't come out for another month. I don't want to spoil this for any of y'all. I want you to gauge whether this is a book that you feel like you can consume. Because if the question is, oh, should I pick up this book? Yes, you should pick it up. If the question is, can I handle some of the trigger warnings in this book? That's a different question. And I can't answer that question for you, but I'm going to try to give you the information that I can so you can answer that question for yourself. So let's honestly start with how this book was such a love story to Appalachia as a whole. Now, let me just say that I am a New Englander. I am from Connecticut. I am a city person. I live in Maine now, but never in my life have I been to an area in Appalachia. And I definitely grew up with that sense of like northern righteousness that everyone grows up with in New England, especially in like the Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts areas. So I've spent a lot of years trying to take myself out of that realm and to show some respect on Appalachia, because like Appalachia deserves that respect more than anything else, whether we're looking at it from a historical point of view or like just acknowledgement that that's like one of the oldest mountain ranges in the entire world and there's some scary shit that goes on there. I'm putting some respect on their name. And this book, you can tell, was written with such love towards the region, and it didn't shy away from like the stereotypes that are often put onto the people who are from Appalachia. It didn't shy away from any of that, but it really embraced like the beauty of its history and the righteousness in which Appalachia has fought for the rights of its workers and just the rights of its people. And one of my favorite parts of this book was for Miles, leaving his town was never an option. This story would have been a million times easier for him if he had just decided that he was ultimately going to leave. But this was his family's home. This was his ancestral home, and the thought of leaving Twist Creek was just not an option for him. He wanted to do better for his community. And I think that is such a beautiful and respectful way to talk about the region, because especially as a New Englander, I know that our response is a lot of the time, oh, why don't you just leave? You shouldn't have to leave the place that you were born, the place that you love, the place that is important to you and your family, just for a sense of safety. And Miles really embodies that. Of like, no, I'm going down with the ship. This is my home. And I loved that so much. It was just beautiful. And once we got to the end, there was a group of people who really came together with some like socialist and communist ideals and really tried to have some realistic conversations about bettering the community, which also was just gorgeous. It was just gorgeously done. The historical discussions around the mines and the union protests surrounding the mines in the early 1900s, the determination to stay in the area and to not be driven out just because he was a queer trans boy, and like the community that banded together towards the end, all just provided such a beautiful story around Appalachia as a whole, even though this was insanely gory and horrifying. Andrew Joseph Wright writes some of the most realistic, like, gut-wrenching gore that I read. I'm not a big gore person. I can handle his gore, but it definitely, like, makes me wince and gag. And a lot of this story revolves around, like, a broken face, like a fractured skull, like a broken eye. Like, the gore really revolves, in Miles' case, around the face. And you could tell that through the cover. Oh my god, it's just horrible to read. It's just horrible to read and to witness. There is violence from the group of boys that the Davies kid runs with. There is violence on Miles and his childhood best friends Cooper's perspective. There is violence from the family. There is violence from the sheriff. There is violence all around. You cannot escape it. And in saying that, I think that all of the violence is very purposeful and is used very well to progress the story. I don't think any of the violence or the gore was just there to like be gory or violent like some books have. It was all incredibly purposeful. It showed the history between Sheriff Davies and Miles and Cooper's and Dallas's, their other childhood best friend, all of their families, and it then ended up showing the progression of how the violence just continues as a generational trauma thing for Miles, Cooper, and Dallas versus Noah Davies, the sheriff's son. So all of the violence was incredibly purposeful, and it definitely showed how those levels of violence move throughout generations. You know, those violent acts, they don't end with the person that you did the violent act to. They flow down the familial chart. It is always there. The effects of it are always there. And we see a lot of it through Miles' friend group as a whole. So we see the generational trauma for Miles as he lives in constant fear of the fact that there is not a question of if there will be violence against him, there is a question of when. And the question is not when only once, it is when again and again and again. And then there is his best friend Cooper, who is affected by the violence from his parents. And ultimately, he has to live with a father who never recovered from the violence that was done to him, for being intertwined with the Abernathy's family as a whole. And the trauma that he experiences is ultimately full of rage and sorrow and is not dealt with well. You can tell that he lacks any sort of real support system with his trauma, despite being like the golden boy. And then there is Dallas, who ultimately has physical effects left from the trauma. They are a severe burn victim, and they have very clearly dealt with their emotional trauma. So they are a great example of what can be had when you have that emotional support system there with you after the trauma. So they're a really great line of progression of here's someone who is affected by the violence and who ultimately does not cope with it and just pushes it down. Here's someone who acknowledges the violence and the trauma and copes with it the best way that they can, but is forever in a state of like paralyzed fear. and here's someone who has had the support system to deal with the trauma, and it still very much affects them, but it is clearly handled better than the other two. So that's kind of where those ideas and those gory aspects kind of lead you. And I think that that is just such an interesting way to do it. And I think that it makes the gore and the violence a little bit more manageable as someone who is not super into gore. And I think that's also one of the reasons why this book can be characterized as a YA instead of an adult. Like, it's not just a YA because it follows teenagers, it's a YA because of the messaging that's pushed forward. And it's just incredibly interesting. Now, another thing that I haven't talked about is the aspects of autism in this book. There is so much autism throughout this book. Oh my god, Miles' parents, Miles, Dallas's parental figure, autism, just autism. And you've got, like, what I think is super funny is, like, you've got the clearly autistic parents, but, like, no one really acknowledges that the autism is there. They just, as a family, like, learn to cope and just exist in this very specific way. And then there's Miles, who ultimately knows that he is quite different, but is ultimately just trying to do what his parents are doing and just kind of cope with it. And then he sees Dallas's parental figure, Amber, and he's just like, oh. And it's just like the pause of, oh my god, this all makes so much sense as to what I've been feeling over my entire life. And I think that the autism representation was ultimately so incredibly well done because it was in your face in the way of, this is the way that these people are living, this is the actions that they're taking to accommodate themselves, even if that's not the words that they want to put towards it. These are the things that they have done in their household to make their house accommodating to themselves. And ultimately, it gives another layer as to why they are such outcasts in this community. Because autism is ultimately a genetic scenario. So if the Abernathys are, like, always considered weird or off as a family, there's probably a level of a reason as to why, and that very easily can be correlated to ableism. And that's just another layer as to the Abernathys as a whole and their relationship to the Davies and the town. Like, this strong sense of justice that has been around since Miles' great-great-grandfather, St. Abernathy. And that sense of justice just kind of keeps trickling down. And even Miles' parents, they both felt that intense sense of justice, and they were ultimately violently traumatized because of that intense sense of justice. Because they wanted things to change, because they wanted things to be right, to be good. So we just keep moving down on, like, the generational trauma and what has caused, like, this sense of being an outcast in this community, and how this violence has continued over so many generations, and why no one else is really stepping in. It's all so fucking interesting. This book was just so good. I could honestly keep talking and breaking it apart more and more and more if you wanted to, but let's kind of move on a little bit because we're getting a little long, and I understand that all of y'all might not be here to break down the book as a whole. You might just be here to figure out if you want to read it or not. And if I haven't convinced you by now, I don't know what's going to convince you. Beautiful historical scenes, like, great world building, intense family lines and connections, intense generational trauma, really messed up relationships as a whole. So Miles, Cooper, and Dallas are all childhood best friends. Miles and Cooper ultimately get together, like, become friends again after Miles's first attack, and their relationship is really weird. So Cooper is the first one to really like start to acknowledge and push forward and accept Miles as a trans boy. And I think that's a really important thing for Miles because Cooper is like the first person that he really came out to. And I think that's a critical relationship, but it is a very, very toxic relationship shadowed by their shared generational trauma in the way that they both deal with their own generational trauma. It's a super messed up relationship, and it leaves Miles sitting there questioning whether Cooper is gay, whether Cooper actually sees him as a boy, or if he still sees him as a girl like everyone else does. It also leaves Miles to consider whether he is asexual, aromantic, if he really even likes people romantically at all. Like, his general identity is ultimately completely caught into question with Cooper, because I don't feel like at any point before this weird relationship with Cooper kind of comes to fruition, Miles is ever really thinking in terms of romance. So it's all just a disaster. And then we get towards the end of the book and they bring Dallas back in, who is non-binary, and ultimately brings a level of sweetness and care and compassion for Miles that he ultimately needs as he's having like a mental breakdown with Cooper, because Cooper's just going crazy, cuckoo bananas, and shenanigans are unfolding. So I think that the way that Cooper was used to kind of progress into Miles's understanding of himself and of his identity until it gets to a point where he can no longer move forward at all because he's just in such emotional distress and peril, and then bringing in Dallas and kind of bringing it the rest of the way and bringing in that emotional understanding, that place to really look in on yourself and understand yourself, the community that he is really looking for. Like, bringing in Dallas really brings Miles as a person full circle, and I think is a big part of the reason why Miles is able to do what he does towards the end of the book. So honestly, at this point, the world building spectacular, the historical elements spectacular, the relationships interesting and spectacular, the violence and gore is all well done and really appropriate, and the writing style as a whole, I just love Andrew Joseph White's writing. It's very accessible and very dynamic. I think that it really pulls you in to the point where sometimes I forget that I'm reading, but it's not overly like wordy and fluid and like descriptive. It's incredibly accessible language, and I appreciate that about him so much. Even as someone who really like, I'm into that artsy fartsy, like overly descriptive, I'm gonna take 2 pages to describe this tree kind of vibe. That's not him, but I still love his writing style. It's just beautiful. So if that is not enough to get you to read this book, I don't know what else could be. How well was this put together as a review? Probably not very, but we had to talk about it all. We had to talk about it all, and I don't want to bring up too much in terms of specifics because this is a non-spoiler review. I want to give y'all the time and space that you need to get excited for this book, and I am not spoiling it for you. So if you are looking for a queer, trans, autistic, Appalachian YA horror, this is the one for you. I put this out there with my whole heart. If you can handle the trigger warnings that I have talked about in this video, then I think that everyone should read this book. I think that this is a fantastic pick for horror readers of all ages. And I just fall in love with Andrew Joseph White with every book I read from him. So with that, I hope that y'all are having the best day, and I will talk to y'all next time. Bye.